Good morning, everyone. Good morning. If I could ask you all to please take your seats. A lot of people coming in the door. Good morning. My name is Jim Brink. I am the chair of radiology at Massachusetts General Hospital and your co-moderator today for this Discovery Cafe Startup to Impact. It's a very exciting session we have planned for you today. We're really asking a host of entrepreneurs to really focus on the key impact that their industry represents to the healthcare community. I'll be representing sort of the clinician's perspective, and we'll be very eager to look at these presentations with a slightly skeptical eye, if I may, but we're eager to hear their particular impact that they will be sharing with you. I'd like to introduce to you my co-moderator, James Nicholls. James is Managing Director at Fitzroy Health. James will be representing sort of an investor's perspective. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to James.
Thanks, Jim. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. We're excited about the panel discussion today. We want to focus on these 5 very extraordinary companies that are doing high impact work in AI in healthcare and life sciences in particular. As part of this preparation for today's discussion, we'll try to work out how could we make this as relevant and interesting as possible, mainly because of the intrigue but also skepticism that exists around AI. I think there has been questions about definition of impact and of likely future outcomes for both the companies and also the impact on healthcare generally. So we've asked today's presenters as part of this panel discussion to focus in on one number, and that is the best representation of impact that their company is having in their particular field. I thought it's only fair that we should also come up with a number of our own, but because I'm a moderator, I felt entitled to cheat a little bit, so I came up with 2 different numbers, and they relate to our own work. Fitzroy Health and partners have been conducting a bunch of work around innovation and commercialization in healthcare. We've looked at about 1,400 investment deals relating to health system investments and commercialization work across dozens of health systems. And so we looked at the 84 different health systems that we're very focused on making material investments in AI, and then the 1,400 different investments over the last few years. And we have determined that there is still a lot of questions about what is the return and what is the impact, and we would like to learn in the coming years and months as we do more research in this area with partners, where are the areas that are going to advance furthest and fastest, and do we have those areas represented here with these panel discussions and companies today. So the 5 different companies that we have who will be presenting their firm's work and their areas of impact are BAE Labs. We have Charles Cadieu, who will be walking us through their work. BenevolentAI and JB Michel. Clinithink and Sarah Beeby, who will be representing their work. Alex Z from Insilico, and VisualDx and Papier will be presenting the work that they've been doing in diagnostics as well. So we will have a 5 to 10 minutes presentation from each of these panel members, and then we'll take Q&As from the audience. But with that, I'll ask Charles if you want to come up and start with 7 minutes, and then we'll move on to the next.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Hi, so I'm Charles Cadieu, co-founder and CEO of BAE Labs. And our mission is to democratize medical imaging by providing quality, value, and access in the hands of new medical professionals. And we do that by enabling and capturing the skills of experts and disseminating throughout the system. I think that's really where, taking the number for us today, we've taken 2 years juxtaposed to 2 days. And this is a demonstration of a bit of how we feel that AI can have the most impact, really as a lever on the expertise that you might be having maybe high-end academic imaging centers. How do we disseminate that throughout the healthcare system and provide more uniformity of care, greater access, and capabilities to improve patient care? So first, let me just start with talking about ultrasound and what it takes today to do ultrasound. So this is a very technical task, and the typical paradigm for training people to do ultrasounds, which is a handheld probe to get medical imagery at the bedside or in imaging labs, is a 2-year program. So sonographers, those technicians that are specialized in performing ultrasounds, go through this 2-year program. And you might ask, well, why is this the case? Why is this so hard? Well, it's because taking that handheld probe, you see an image on the screen. To you and I, us non-specialists or non-experts, this image is completely uninterpretable. We have no idea where we are, where we should be going from that specific position. And that skill, that intuition, is actually captured by those expert sonographers. That's what they're learning through this program, as well as clinical physiology as well. I kind of describe it a bit like trying to cut your own hair in a funhouse mirror. So you can kind of figure it out, and it's going to be really tough at first, but over time you can get good at that. You can practice over and over, and a little bit that's what the sonographers have captured and done in their training program. Compare that though to a study that just started at Northwestern Medicine, where we're having certified medical assistants using our AI to become proficient in doing bedside echocardiograms, ultrasounds of the heart. That AI then is guiding those new individuals that have no previous ultrasound experience to obtain some of that skill that they never had before. And again, that's kind of where we feel like these big impacts of AI can start to materialize. So that's the acquisition side of the equation of ultrasound. How do you help someone that maybe have never done ultrasound before? Beyond certified medical assistants, you can think of emergency room physicians, hospitalists that are going around the hospital at the bedside, other healthcare providers, even primary care doctors that might want to improve their physical exam, start to adopt this technology for the acquisition side of the equation. But there's also the interpretation side as well. So taking imagery, using AI then to interpret, create measurements and assessments from that imagery that's just been collected. And just last summer, we had the first FDA-cleared deep learning algorithm for echocardiography. And just last month, we had some work presented at the American College of Cardiology showing that algorithm is comparable to expert cardiologists in assessing ejection fraction, the number one thing you want to find from echocardiography. So that technology we can apply throughout the spectrum, and we're working also to help sonographers and cardiologists to perform better exams in their labs. And we've also announced a partnership with Edwards Lifesciences, where we're helping with quality and diagnostic accuracy in imaging labs, and then supporting a lot of that work through scientific publications that you'll see coming out, and have had some in this last few months as well. Let me just kind of pause and talk about, again, the impact we see here. So this is a little bit on the how do you get this done, but what is the disease spectrum that we're talking about? And ultrasound has huge implications throughout the spectrum. But within cardiovascular disease, it is just an epidemic. And we need to provide new tools and new resources to healthcare systems to scale the ability to catch disease earlier and at low cost and in the hands of new users. And this is an example of how we think that can start to happen at increased efficiencies, at high quality. And as we've, of course, told the stories about how these technologies can impact, we hear countless stories from friends and relatives about cardiovascular disease that's only circumstantially maybe found out. In fact, my mom was one such a person who only circumstantially found out through an ultrasound exam that she actually had a congenital condition, and she was, of course, found and treated. But we think that there's many others out there that are only too late in the game, getting treatments, getting found that they have the disease to that appropriate timing and intervention that the healthcare system provide. And just to summarize, but this is where we feel that AI can have the biggest impact, is scaling expertise, leveraging that expertise out to and from the academic centers to the community hospitals to primary cares and clinics, throughout the United States and throughout the world. So thank you.
Okay, Charles, thank you. I'm going to ask just one quick question, if I may, and that is your impact is really about reducing the barrier to execution and training and execution of echocardiography. What comes next in your pipeline?
Sure. Well, I think just first, this is really a big impact here within sonography. So it's a labor market in the U.S. It's about $8 billion labor market and about 100,000 plus sonographer technicians that are out there in the U.S. today. Where we think this goes next is also on that same trajectory, though, and we want to look at starting how do you examine the physical exam. So thinking about those may be 500 million physician-patient encounters happening every year, where the doctors are literally putting their hands and pressing on you, and then using a stethoscope, which is this 200-year-old technology. Well, ultrasound and the reduction of cost and size, that's already here. That problem is essentially solved of how you have an ultrasound probe that can plug into a smartphone. What's not here is giving those clinicians and other professionals the confidence to pick up that probe, to get to high quality imagery, to know what it is that they're seeing, to perform that exam, and to get to accurate diagnostic results. So we feel that that's really the next kind of big area for us, and it's here now with some of these technologies.
Great, thank you.
Great, thanks.
Hi, so I'm JB. I'm from BenevolentAI. So a little bit about us, and then I'll get to this number. So we're an end-to-end drug discovery company based on tech. And so we span the full spectrum, from target identification to lead optimization, patient certification. We also have our own lab internally, which enables us to bring small molecule therapeutics up to the clinic. So we're about 200 people, a bit more than that now. We're engineers, data scientists, clinicians, chemists, and we're split across the UK and New York now. We have a growing team. Come see us. We're a fun team. And we're all united by a core belief, which is that, and I'm pretty sure it's shared by all the people here and probably you guys, which is that we can bring very large benefits to the patients by redesigning a large part of the drug discovery process with engineering first and data first principles in mind. And we think that the time is now because there's a lot of data available, quite obviously, and AI has gotten to the point where it's now credible enough to meaningfully enhance experts in the field, like Charles has just shown, and also to sometimes outpace experts. So I could tell you about a lot of internal numbers about how our hypotheses have high quality, about the molecules we produce, or about the engineering pipeline we built. But as I said, we're an end-to-end company. So the impact that we want to see in the world is the number of patients and the number of indications that we actually materially help at the end of the day. And as you know, in drug discovery, that is a journey, which is pretty long. So we're not there yet. I'm hoping I can tell you about that some other time. But instead, I'll tell you about the early part of our journey. So, that's our data. It's the benevolent knowledge graph. So we were founded a few years ago, and the knowledge graph is the answer to that idea on which we were founded, which is what would happen if you're able to represent if possible, most of the biomedical information available out there. What if you're able to represent it in one place in a way that both machines and humans could read from it and could write back to it? What would that do? So we spent the last 5 years and $200 million of investment and a lot of talent building something that was an answer to that. So we integrate actually a lot of data sources, most of which you know, private, public, chemical, biological. A lot of information we ingest, we normalize, we structure it, and in cross-functional teams, so we have engineers sitting next to life scientists to make that data really high quality and really valuable. And at the end of the day, we have a really powerful technology, knowledge graph, that helps us advance and bring eventually things to patients. So there's one number that illustrates the scale at which we're doing that, which is this number here. There's 140 million papers and patents that we extract information from. Of course, it's very large, and it grows all the time. So there's about 100,000 new papers added to PubMed every month. This is far too much for anyone to read, quite obviously. So we've developed a state-of-the-art natural language processing pipeline, which is a form of AI, to read all of that and structure it in the appropriate way. So it turns out that doing this is quite valuable for us because a lot of that information that we extract is not available otherwise in any structured database that we could find. And in fact, for many of the indications that we look at for our internal drug discovery pipelines, a lot of these indications have most of the information that come from those sources. So that provides us a really strong advantage. So that data, the quality of it that we've enforced painstakingly over 5 years, that kind of volume is what our AI relies on. This is why we're able to make really big strides in the generation of novel hypotheses. This is why we're able to design molecules in a better and faster way internally. And it's also one of the reasons why we're able to find new groups of patients that might better answer to therapies. And also, it does translate into experimental successes that I hope I can tell you about some other time. Thank you. Any question?
Yeah, thanks, JB. Quick question. Last year, with the acquisition of Proxima Gen, that expanded your capacity across the full R&D process. Wanted to get your thoughts about the impact that it has on your company, but also more broadly for the market.
Yes, indeed, we acquired internal lab capacity last year. The way we read into this is that, I guess, AI is getting serious now. We have experimental capacity that puts us on par with some of the more established firms out there. And I guess it makes us more credible, but what's more important is that it makes the field more credible. I think it signals a shift in the market where now it's not just AI in the ether or algorithm somewhere, it's actually applied to an experimental pipeline that will end up in the clinic at some point. So, yeah. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Just waiting for the screen to turn orange. Here we go. Okay. Good afternoon. I'm here to talk about Clinithink. We're a small London headquartered business, but we have a large amount of activity in the US. I'd say that's probably our fastest and largest growing market to date. And I'm going to take you on a journey. The company was originally founded by two frustrated doctors who spent a lot of their time at the time writing copious notes and information about patients, their stories, their treatment, and everything else that they felt relevant. And they became very frustrated at the limited amount of usage of all of that data that was at the time stored in paper files, but it now is stored in various different places around data warehouses. And so one went off to learn and understand and build and sell EMRs, and the other one spent a long time immersing himself in NLP. And the combination of those two formed the business about 8 years ago, and spent a lot of time really understanding how to utilize NLP and train NLP in a way that actually thinks, reads, and understands like a clinician. I picked the number at the top of the slide for this particular presentation to emphasize speed. So if you imagine a world where a machine can read 2 million documents an hour, where could that take us? To get access to the product, to the market, we've utilized a slightly different approach in terms of deploying our technology. We work predominantly at the moment with large healthcare institutions, and we deploy our software within their data warehouse. That enables us to be able to access any narrative documentation that's available across that ecosystem. And as we continue to expand that implementation model, we're also expanding into community hospitals, chains of individual and groups of doctors' practices, and we're also looking at healthcare data exchange data. And this enables us to have bigger data sets to derive greater insights from. And some of the other interesting pieces we've found as we've gone on this journey is that the data accuracy, it comes up a lot. We do a lot of work with our institutions once we're deployed on helping them understand some of their claims data, some of the revenue cycle information. And actually, as you work through a lot of that information, by having greater access to signs, symptoms, and other pieces of information that are not necessarily accurately coded, you start to understand that some of the current structured data that we're utilizing is not as accurate as it could be. And so we really feel that we're actually very close to the source. It's actually probably as close as you can get, utilizing all of that extremely rich narrative across every instance that a patient has been on their journey. We are currently deployed in a number of US sites. We will have 100 million patient lives worth of data, on track for that by the end of 2019, and we have a very aggressive growth plan into 2020 to expand into other currently English language speaking territories. So how have we utilised all that knowledge? To date, I look after our life science business, and became very obvious that whilst utilising a lot of the insights locally within our healthcare providers to support some of their initiatives around population health and understanding their own patient populations, there are, of course, useful insights that by running our queries and utilising SNOMED concepts, we can actually provide insights into many different areas. To give some examples, we've only been on this journey for about 18 months within that sector. Looking in clinical research specifically, we ran some queries on a GI protocol. It's actually in Crohn's disease recently. And by having Crohn's disease and 2 of the other inclusion criteria in that particular protocol, you were directly linked to at least one of 5 of the top exclusion criteria. And so by running that search, we were able to see that that protocol was virtually impossible to recruit. Now, that study was already running, so there were minimal modifications that became made. But having had that insight earlier, and with some work we were able to do with some community data actually looking at statin intolerance prevalence later on, we were able to demonstrate that the true prevalence of statin intolerance patients in the community was actually a lot higher by using signs and symptoms and inference than perhaps was available in some of the larger data sets. We've done quite a lot of work in oncology. We're able to stage disease very effectively, so we're able to pull in a number of different data points, dig a bit deeper, which means that you're able to maybe watch these patients that are interest as they progress through their disease state. Obviously, for a clinical trials perspective, we've been able to support research teams to actually capture those patients in a very short time window by having regular access to regular refreshed data sets and enabling that information to be available to that clinical team and to the research team in a very timely manner so that they can build it into their workflow and offer those patients an opportunity to have research as a treatment option. We've done a lot of work in rare disease. That's probably one of the areas that has been seen to be a quite natural home for us to start with. We have mapped the human phenotype ontology and have done some amazing work with Rady Children's Hospital, where we were able to read an individual patient's set of notes within 20 seconds and provide a diagnosis. So some of that work is being utilised in newborn screening programs, and many of our partners are also looking at phenotyping alongside their genomics works. And so what does all this mean? We don't know. As we work through different projects and we identify different insights, we're able to provide interesting insights into drugs, matching drugs to patients. We were able to look at preventative medicine and different types of applications of the insights that we're able to derive. And I think overall, by having the product deployed behind the firewall, being utilised by healthcare practitioners and professionals, I genuinely believe providing those insights as a tool will enable better healthcare for all of us as patients or future patients. Thank you.
Terrific, Sarah. Thank you. If I may ask, you recently signed a deal with Northwell Health, I understand, to deploy your Clicks platform. Could you tell us more about the impact you expect to see from that partnership and perhaps other similar partnerships going forward?
Sure. So Northwell Health, actually the initial request for the team within their institution was to help understand in more depth their clinical trials portfolio. So they have a reasonable number, 400 to 500 protocols running at any one time. And I suppose different focuses across the service lines in terms of approach to research. And so we were able to shed some insights both on true available patient populations before they take research on, so enabling to make informed decisions about whether to take trials on before you start and go through the startup process, but also to identify where there are pockets of truly available patients that perhaps don't necessarily coincide with the principal investigator for those particular trials. So being able to open some really interesting dialogue about how to both resource and deliver research for the benefit of the patient population and obviously within their institution. Primary focus, but we're also supporting within their administration, revenue cycle, population health, medical malpractice, and many other areas that we're enabling their teams and working with their informatics teams to get greater insights. So,
thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Alex Zhavoronkov, so let's put us on the slide. Before I start, how many of you have heard about Insilico medicine? Can you raise your hand? So a few. And how many of you read our papers? Okay, great. So we are the end-to-end drug discovery company, and we don't have our own lab. We have several AI labs, but we rely on external partners and many CROs for validation. We work with about 200 different collaborators worldwide, academics and smaller companies alike. And we have several big pharma companies working with us at various stages. So we prefer to work with smaller companies primarily because it's a closer partnership, and we can sometimes get access to early preclinical data from disease-relevant assays. We think that it's extremely important to have a human disease-relevant assay to be able to validate the target. In our case, we start with the omics data primarily in target identification. So we have about 4.7 million gene expression samples in the database linked to many, many other data types. And we mine it within disease context to identify novel targets. But as you know, target ID is a very tricky process. And until you are finishing phase 2, you really don't know whether the target is correct or not in many diseases. So that is why we decided to focus also on generative chemistry to be able to generate novel molecules very, very quickly and basically leapfrog the target validation process in many areas, specifically in disease-relevant models. So we are one of the pioneers in generative chemistry. We publish about 2 research papers a month nowadays, so we are pretty productive, primarily with collaborators in generative chemistry and also in target ID. We work with Wuxi AppTech, which does a lot of our synthesis and validation. So today, we actually develop a lot of our own methods. We're not only applying AI, we're also developing our own methods, primarily focusing on generative adversarial networks and reinforcement learning and combination of the two in both target ID space and generative chemistry space. And we also work a little bit on personalized medicine to see how we can stratify the patient subpopulations and also identify ways to establish target heterogeneity and how a specific target is in a specific disease, or looking at multi-targeting as well. So we start with omics data, but we also have a knowledge graph based on text. I mine about $1.7 trillion worth of grant funding over the past 25 years. So you can all go to a system called Pharmacognitive, type a gene name, and look at who is who in the field by the amount of money they received, and the papers they published and clinical trials they established. So we use that system to identify also pockets of data that is unpublished. We ingest it, and we look for novel targets using this data to see if there is any prior art to support our hypothesis from the omics space. So some of the case studies that I can give you. So one case study with a big pharma partner, of course, I cannot talk about who it is and what the disease area is. So we had, after several pilots, we got a really interesting project. We were challenged to identify targets within a specific disease of interest and generate small molecules for those targets very quickly in one pipeline. So it actually took us longer to sign the contract than to do the work. And within half a year, we've identified novel target and validated in there experimental system. And we also generated novel unpatented molecules for this target, actually for a range of targets. So within less than half a year, we've managed to go from target ID to target validation. Internally, we recently did an experiment also with WuXi. I cannot talk about the specifics of the experiment, but they challenged us to a reasonably challenging protein target. And within 20 days, we've developed only a few inhibitors for that target using generative chemistry approach. Synthesized, tested in enzymatic assays, tested in biological assays, and now we have microsomal stability and PK data for those molecules. So within less than 2 months, we went from target to really great hits. We gave them just a few, 60% hit rate, lots of nanomolar hits. So now GANs work for generative chemistry. And with one of the smaller companies that we've collaborated with, and we're still collaborating with, we partnered in August last year. They challenged us to a reasonably difficult target, and they provided us with some biological data around it. So we went from representation of novel target to single-digit nanomolar hits that also have specific properties embedded in them in less than 3 months, but we did a few iterations. So we first ordered molecules from vendor libraries, got some hits, and then learned on those hits and generated novel molecules with specific properties that not only hit the target, but also supposedly have other properties embedded with them using GANs. So I think that currently we are at the forefront of a revolution in AI. So a lot of people are talking about hype and overhype in the area. So that's true, and a lot of people are using really credible advances in AI to raise money and to popularize the research or popularize the company. But I think there is a lot of credibility in the field as well. And I think there is an opportunity to save 2 to 3 years in drug discovery time just because we can link target ID and small molecule generation in one go and very quickly validate the targets, and also that allows you to fail quickly. And just by very, very primitive calculations, it gives you about $20 million in savings in R&D if you are a small biotech. And in big pharma, where costs are higher, you get higher savings. So another trend that we're going after is innovative biotechnology industry in China. So if you haven't realized that trend, you probably should look at that, because there are many, many, many new companies mushrooming all over the region with great targets, and they need molecules. So we can satisfy that need and partner with those companies and get a lot of data, creating the largest data factory on the planet for early preclinical research. So I think that currently we're at the inception point of AI. A lot of technology is proven, and we need to embrace it and go with it. So in our case, we have a saying in the company, so that incremental innovation needs pilots. Radical innovation needs courage. So let's be courageous. Thank you.
Thanks. Alex.
Oh.
I just had a quick question. You mentioned credibility. You think there's credibility in the market, presumably with your own organization. There are other organizations that try to define what credibility means. Last year, Frost & Sullivan awarded you best practices for both the research and the ability to bring new products to market, especially around age management. I just wanted to know from you, what do you think signifies credibility? What evidence is there that organizations like Frost & Sullivan or anyone, including investors, are looking for, and what do you pride yourself on at Insilico?
So I think that credibility is twofold. One is credibility in AI. So you really need to publish cutting-edge papers and present at conferences like NeurIPS or ICML, very, very specialized, to get endorsement from really top expert and also hire talent competitively. So we hire through competitions. But I think that credibility in pharma only comes through experimental data. So if you cannot present great molecules and target validation with sufficient data, you wouldn't be able to gain credibility. So I think it's important to publish incrementally, but also support your arguments with experimental data. Because regardless of what AI you use, if the medicinal chemist looks at your molecules and doesn't get kind of the excitement with the data that you provide, you are not going to make a deal. And most likely you are not going to go into late preclinical. unless the molecules look good and experimental data looks good. So it's very important to establish credibility through experimentation. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Art Papier. I'm a dermatologist and CEO of VisualDx. VisualDx is a company that's been around for 20 years. We're dedicated to improving point-of-care decisions and improving diagnosis. And so VisualDx is currently licensed into over 2,300 hospitals and large clinics. When we started the company, our vision was the visualization of medical thinking and visualization of complexity at the point of care. So we didn't name it DermDx, we named it VisualDx, and VisualDx can handle any symptom, any complaint. The need we're trying to fill is this huge problem we have that Dr. Chu mentioned this morning about diagnostic error. It's pretty clear that about 15% of all diagnoses are wrong. So when we started collecting many, many images, and we also started developing a knowledge base. And first of all, an apology for this image during lunch, but if you know a dermatologist, this is what dermatologists do. They always show horrible images while people are eating. So this is a picture taken by Dr. Brown, and our number is 43 seconds. And I chose 43 seconds because at the point of care, you have to be fast. And if you're not fast, clinicians are not going to use clinical decision support. So Dr. Brown had a resident come to him last year and say, we have an elderly woman in cubicle 5 that developed this lesion. It started small. She tied a string around it. She ripped it off. And 2 weeks later, it grew back 5 times the size. And I don't know what it is, Dr. Brown. So that's the resident reporting to the attending. Dr. Brown, who's the chair of emergency medicine at University of Maryland, said, well, I have an app for that. Because the University of Maryland had licensed our system last year. And he pulls out the phone, he takes this picture, he has permission from the patient to have the image used, and takes the picture, and he's using our app, and there's the picture in the app, and it analyzes the image, and it does it in less than a second on the iPhone. So we're using a technique that Apple's developed to put your machine learning algorithm on the phone itself. So it's using something called Core ML. So on an iPhone 7 or faster, it's analyzed in a second, and we had to put a progress bar there, a dummy progress bar, because when we did our initial usability testing, the doctors didn't know anything happened. It happened so fast. So we put this dummy progress bar that creeps along for 2 seconds. And then on the bottom of the screen, it shows the skin lesion morphologies. And so one of the things that we're advocating is that we think about AI not as artificial intelligence, but AI as augmented intelligence. And one of the keys to good dermatologic diagnosis is to be able to describe what you're seeing. So non-dermatologists see 65% of skin disorders. Only 35% of skin disorders are handled by dermatologists. So they're seeing primary care physicians, they're seeing ER docs, and to variable success, physicians that are not dermatologists range from calling it, it's a rash, or it's a lesion. They don't really describe what you're seeing. So one of the things that we've did over the long track record of our company is we encoded all the images by the morphology in the picture. So we've coded the images with words like in the lower left, it says friable papule, and then it says skin ulcer, and then it says skin erosion. So the machine learning picked it up. The best results were 3 out of 80 morphologies. It puts it on the bottom, and then Dr. Brown says, well, I don't know what friable papule means, but the picture looks like the patient. And then he adds that it's on the fingers, and it gives him a differential diagnosis. So the other part of thinking about AI as augmented intelligence is to really think about how we enabling the differential diagnosis process. So rather than just saying AI believes it's a 99% probability that it's this diagnosis, to really be safe, I think here in 2019, we always have to be thinking about the differential diagnosis. So Dr. Brown gets this differential diagnosis, and he sees at the very top this bloody thing on a finger, and so then he clicks that, and the next screen shows him examples of lobular capillary hemangiomas, also called pyogenic granulomas, many images of this benign tumor on fingers. And he's exploring this in the exam room in front of the patient with the resident, and he told me it was a thinking out loud process. And the patient loved that he was doing it. Now, this is a huge change in healthcare, because doctors used to say to us when we started our company, I would never look things up in front of the patient. It would show that we don't know. But now patients are on Google for an hour or two before they see us. And so when we come in and we only spend a minute with them, they're really wondering, do we know? So the fact that Dr. Brown had this tool that he was doing and explaining to the patient actually built confidence in the physician and from the patient's perspective. Another point is that we've been systematically collecting images for 20 years and purposely making sure that we have imagery of disease across all skin types. So light skin all the way, we call this Fitzpatrick type 1 through 6 in dermatology. 6 would be very dark skin. And so we've been collecting these images and tagging them as well by the skin pigmentation type. So the machine learning is also trained across the spectrum of skin disorders. And that was the image that helped to confirm the diagnosis. And he did that in 43 seconds. He went from the process of taking the picture, putting in finger, reviewing the differential diagnosis, and coming up with the likely answer. And he texted the image to the dermatologist at the university, who responded more than 24 hours later saying, good job, Dr. Brown, you nailed it. So one of the needs that we're filling is this global shortage of specialists. So here in the US, we're very specialty focused, but around the world, there are no dermatologists. In certain parts of Africa, there are just certainly no dermatologists. So driving this technology to the generalist is a really key thing. And next up for us is we've created an app called AYSA, A-Y-S-A, that's now available on Android and iOS for consumers, so you can get self-triage as well. Thank you.
Great. All right, thank you very much. Apps such as these do require an enormous amount of input data to train them adequately. How is your company addressing privacy issues?
So in terms of privacy, dermatology, unlike radiology, you actually can recognize yourself. It's very hard for a person to say, that's my chest x-ray, or that's my bone film. But in dermatology, we've always had a need for using imagery to teach patients. And so we used to have this stuff called film and this stuff called Kodachromes. And dermatologists collected images on film and Kodachromes for years, and they would develop relationship with the patient, and we'd have signed consents, and we'd ask the patient if we could use their image for teaching. So during the lifespan of our company, we've been methodically and seriously collecting images from a HIPAA perspective, an ethical perspective. We don't put black bars across the images. We crop images. We have written permission from patients. And we've done it in a way that we have an image collection manager who's been with us for 17 years, and she's gained the confidence of physicians that have spent their life collecting images, so they trust us. So a big part of what we're doing, it's not a wiki model. It's working with physicians and universities that want to share their images to improve diagnosis.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We're going to take questions from the audience now. There's a microphone, I think, that's making its way around. So if people have questions of any of the panelists, please raise your hand, and we'll start taking those questions. Let me start while the microphone finds its way to the gentleman. I have a question for anyone who's willing to take it. We're talking about the labor shortage in certain specialty areas, derm and other areas. I'm interested in the labor shortage in AI as well, the technical expertise that each of your firm needs in order to advance your science. If any of you were willing to take about the battle for labor from a commercial perspective, that's very interesting.
Sure, yeah. Certainly all of us are experiencing this and handling this from, in Silicon Valley can be quite challenging with, literally competing against offers from, Google and Apple and Facebook and all. So we encounter this daily. What we found is that, recruiting from our personal networks over, decades in the field certainly helps. But what's really kind of unique is, I think, shared by many of the people here, is that when you can combine, the cool technology of deep learning with that patient impact and that impact on healthcare, that is sort of these unique things you can bring to the table for those types of candidates. And, it has to be a right match. So it can't be just someone looking for a generic AI job. They have to be matched to that purpose with that cool technology too.
Yeah, I would add to that. I'm in New York. I recruit a lot in New York, and it's different than in Silicon Valley because we found that in New York at least we have a really interesting value proposition. There's a lot of very talented AI scientists and engineers in that city, but there's not that many companies who propose a mission that they can connect to on a really deep level. So in fact, we're finding differentially a pretty good spot in New York. I think if we were in the Silicon Valley, that would be a different question.
Yeah, I think we found ourselves in a slightly unique position because we're so deeply embedded in SNOMED. We've actually kind of recategorized some of it that we've got some very limited expertise in the world. So actually expanding on that is quite a challenge. Coupled with the same competition around strong architects, engineers, and people that can support us. And actually, interestingly, through our work, actually more with our partner sites and out in the field, we're sort of redefining some of those roles. So we have a lot of doctors, physicians, nurses, and terminologists on our team. So that's become a whole role in its own right, just understanding ontologies and training and updating the machine every day. So we're actually finding we're creating new roles. I find myself writing some creative job descriptions, trying to look for different skill sets. So yeah, interesting.
So we historically hire through competitions. We announce a hackathon, and then we identify people who can solve a problem within 48 hours or 6 days. Most of them have PhDs, but they are battle tested. And we also employed geographic arbitrage, so we don't differentiate between geographies. That's why we have 4 regional R&D offices, and we're going to have one in China. Right now, the AI skill set is being commoditized in a very big way. So while we are talking, right now more than 100,000 people are taking all kinds of deep learning courses. So especially in China, which is going to become a leader in this area by far. So a lot of companies focusing on very primitive AI applications are going to be outcompeted in a big way, already outcompeted. So what we are struggling with right now, and I'm hiring, so we are looking for people with pharma experience who can commercialize this technology. And if you are interested, just approach me after this. It's a good conference to say that. Yeah, we are looking for a CEO right now.
Well, having a mission-driven company helps to recruit young talent, and the other advantage we have is being in a university town that has a large technology university. Rochester Institute of Technology is our farm system for many of our engineers and professors over there. So small town, USA, real estate's really cheap compared to living in Silicon Valley or Boston. So you're actually able to retain people because they want a quality of life. And so I think you'll see over time this really being democratized engineering so that small towns can thrive with good people as well.
Alex Sherman, Neurological Clinical Research Institute, Mass General. So I'm one of those who sits on this wealth of clinical data connected to GWAS files, biofluids, omics, and so on. So I've been approached by several panelists here as well to share data. And in the view of the latest developments, like, or probably some of you heard that last week the US government asked Carbon X to divest its $100 million investment into patients like me. So on the basis of the security or data medical records concerns and so on. So the question is, so basically, and Alex brought it upon himself with advertising Chinese companies, is when I am reviewing data requests from companies like yours, shall I consider on top of the scientific merits or whether the company is headquartered in Oxford or in Hong Kong, or shall I dig even deeper and see who are the investors and shareholders of that company? Is it my responsibility to do this, because eventually data will end up elsewhere?
So it's a very good question and a very tough one to answer, because cancer knows no borders. Alzheimer's knows no borders. So pretty much a trade war on human life data is a war on your own people. So at my company, we have people who represent all kinds of nationalities, and some of them have all kind of weird family names like mine, that you would automatically be biased when you look at the name. But in our case, I think that we are operating in healthcare, and if you are discriminating in any way, the ability to turn data into products that will save lives and probably result in cures, you're committing a crime against humanity. So people should realize that. And we do not differentiate whether the data comes from China, where it's actually much more abundant than here, and nowadays much higher quality in volume. So it's actually much better to be based there than here. Longitudinal data, not so much, but right now there are huge data collection efforts there, and people are much less privy of their data. So as long as you're not breaking any rules, it's better to be based in China. But at the same time, to answer your question, I think right now it's very important to talk to the lawyers to ensure that you are very legally protected and you are keeping the data you are working with within the country that you are operating in. So that's why we also have regional offices, and we do not transfer data back and forth. So never. Only the features from the models after the model is published. So that's our idea. And we also try not to touch genomic data, because that's a big no-no for a lot of people. So we think that in the data economics context, transcriptomic data or some other more or less anonymized data types are more valuable for target ID. So GWAS is great, but you can live without it. But I think what's happening right now is it needs to stop.
I've got another perspective. Well, no, I mean, part of our deployment mechanism has been to deliberately keep the data with the data owners, recognizing the challenges around transferring data out of its home, and then also even cross borders. So we don't actually store or pull any data into our exchange. It stays on site with the data owner. We will take aggregate insights that are just builds of numbers, but we will not have anything that links that directly back to individual patients. So we've taken a lot of time and thought around that deployment mechanism to work within the current guidelines. Ultimately, there's a much bigger debate about who owns data. I'd say we do, but we're not there at the moment. The technologies are there to enable us to all have access to large data sets and play with it, but there's a lot of work to do around getting us to that point. So deliberately kept our mechanism to work within current data practice and privacy laws.
I mean, who knows me, I'm all for data sharing. The question is it a separate facet that we brought upon us, legal facet,
it
right?
is.
On top of HIPAA and GDPR
Yep.
and all these other things, or shall we just dismiss it for now?
So that's really interesting. We've been having lots of regulatory discussions about where we sit, and because we don't pull data in and we're not making actual decisions on the data. It's a search tool for clinicians to utilize. The liability or the ownership does sit within whoever the data owner is, not so much with us, but we obviously work with everyone that we work with to ensure that we are very clear about where those regulations begin and end. So we support on it, but a lot of that liability still stays there. So yes, probably is adding a bit more onto that system.
Other questions? Well, while we're waiting, Jim, I have a question for you. You promised us some skepticism or a clinician skepticism from your position as a clinical leader at Mass General. What are the kinds of questions that today's presentations raise? What are the concerns that it raises? What answers do you want from technology companies that are promising AI?
Thank you. That's a great question. And actually, I'm going to spin it a teeny bit to really focus perhaps on Charles and Art. And that is, if you envision the practice of echocardiography or dermatology 10, 20 years from now, I can imagine that you're envisioning more and more end-to-end solutions from acquisition of either dermatologic imagery or echocardiography to automatic interpretation and so forth. And I can also imagine that to motivate your own employee base, that this is the vision that you would articulate to really inspire the employees to advance that technology to that end-to-end solution. At the same time, I can also envision that those concepts are actually sort of terrifying to your consumer base or your customer base. And so I guess I'm wondering, how do you reconcile those issues between how you inspire your employee base and how do you reconcile that with your customer base?
Sure, I think you're absolutely right to point out that sort of juxtaposition there, and I think what we're seeing from the clinician side is just feelings of being overwhelmed, wanting to go home in time for dinner. How do they keep up with the disease burden of cardiovascular disease? And where and how they can disseminate some of the routine measurements. I talked to many doctors that, if they could help them to never look at a normal echo again, they would love that. Just to be able to focus their skills at the top of their credentialing and really drive their expertise as opposed to kind of churning through the normals, churning through the routine to help them look at that skill. Also just mentioned that we've seen also as dissemination in healthcare, just in ultrasound, for example, in radiology, as ultrasound got into emergency rooms, for example, what he actually found is that, quite contrary to maybe assumptions, is that actually utilization in radiology actually went up. That's because people are more cognizant of the things you can find out from ultrasound. They're finding more things that need then advanced studies, and that actually is quite contrary to what you might find. And I think that sort of the baseline is that there's just this disease epidemic, no shortage of sort of demand for examination.
Thank you. Well, the context for that question of really have to look at this bigger picture where we're at in American healthcare. We're spending over $3 trillion. We're ranked 37th in the world. Physician burnout is at the top of the laundry list of problems in healthcare, physician suicide. So I think our customers and our employees are saying, everybody's saying we have to do something to fix this broken system. And in our world, in terms of our mission, thinking about this problem of diagnosis, the National Academy of Science 2015 report said that every American will likely experience a diagnostic error in their lifetime. And so the challenge really of what the primary care clinician or the ER clinician has, which is to know all of medicine in their brain and see a different patient every few minutes and expect to be flawless, it's a myth that you really can do that. And so I think our employees are motivated to work on that challenge, and our customers are thirsting for something different, but we're all constrained by fee-for-service medicine. If we don't change the way we're compensating the system, we're really not going to make quick progress.
Thank you. Certainly want to encourage questions from the floor, so please raise your hand.
Thank you. Shadi Al-Salibi, I'm a physician at Mass General. Thank you very much for showcasing your companies to us. I'm a pediatrician, I'm a clinician foremost, but I'm also a researcher. And I had always felt that pediatrics are the sort of underserved population in healthcare. So my question to you guys, how can you leverage AI within your companies, or how are you leveraging AI in the companies to advance the care of children?
So, can take that one. One of the things that motivate people at Benevolent is when we look at the number of indications out there that are left untreated, and when we compare that number, which is in the high thousands, with the number of new molecular entities that are approved each year, which is in the 50. And so I think the hope that we have is if we're able to build a system that reliably delivers targets, molecules, or patient certification with a big technological leverage, meaning that it's inexpensive and reliable, then the space of indications that we can apply that to suddenly opens in a very large way. And then we start to shift the economics that drive the focus of most healthcare drug discovery companies, and makes it possible to address underserved populations, rare diseases, pediatric, in a lot of cases, pediatric diseases. There are a few instances in our company where we've looked at that. It's happy to talk with you more about that later. But that's where I see the promise of AI. That's why I joined Benevolent and why I joined the field a few years ago, is because I think if we all work together on creating a much higher technological leverage, we can really expand the number of indications that we bring meaningful change to.
Yeah, I could speak a little bit to that. I could certainly empathize with that concern there, and it's a smaller market, so some of the dollars go there later. But I think what I can point out is some work we've done in rheumatic heart disease, which is a disease that affects pediatric populations, teens and children in their 20s, and it's in the developing world. It affects maybe actually about 16 million people worldwide, and about 250,000 people die from this disease every year. And there's some hope that if you could bring diagnostics earlier in that pipeline, you could have better interventions and treatments, maybe even subvert that rheumatic heart disease with even penicillin, simple drug there. And what we've done then is shown how you can use ultrasound and echo in the hands of teachers in, for example, Kenya, to diagnose or to get assessments with the AI, to be guided to the right imagery, to then have an interpretation of rheumatic heart disease in its earlier stages. And these are very preliminary activities, but kind of shows where this can go, and maybe even have some impact on that 250,000 people in their teens and 20s that are dying every year.
Craig, I think we have a question here. While the microphone makes its way over, one of the reasons that you have been selected for this panel discussion is that your companies have had an impact and you've been able to talk about it. That can only happen if there's been clinical adoption, or if there's been adoption of some sort, which is usually one of the hardest things. It's not necessarily the best science, it's the best adoption or the best demonstration of it. What lessons have you learned about clinical adoption? How does your science find its way into the traditional provider setting of health systems in whichever market you're operating? It strikes me as an extremely difficult part of the market access piece to prove that you're even onto something.
Yeah.
Sarah, you want to start?
I'll kick that one off. I think for me the journey's been really interesting. So primarily we are a technology and AI business. And so many of the people within our organization see a world where the technology will just go out there and do everything and solve everything, and actually it's technology and people that truly drives that forward. And I think there's often an underestimation of how much time is needed to engage, help people understand, and really work with and around your technology to truly get adoption. You cannot just, as I like to call it, drop software and run, when you've got so many different stakeholders that you need to engage with. And I'd say that's probably been the heaviest lift for us and the biggest learning for some of my investors who are more healthcare and technology focused, rather than perhaps actually delivering services wrapped around that. So
more time, but what about specific tactics? Is it a matter of finding the right champion at a health system or a research institute? Jim, you might be able to help them out, but what are some of the other specific things that have allowed you to get a breakthrough in terms of adoption?
I can let others speak.
Well, I think the challenge is how heterogeneous physicians are. So there's such a spectrum of, they're not like pilots, where pilots train on simulators. They all fly the plane basically the same way. So in our experience, we have power users, early adopters that are using information technology in the exam room elegantly. And right next door in the same clinic, you have a physician who has no interest in using information technology. So that makes it difficult to say that you're going to quickly get everybody to adopt, because you're not. And so part of our strategy is to bring the tools to patients as well and have patients be a driving force. So because we've created this knowledge base and image base on one platform, our view is that you have to balance the patients and the physicians and use the patients as change agents.
If I may offer just one caveat for radiology, one of the biggest challenges is really introducing AI algorithms into the clinical platforms, because we generate reports on hundreds of thousands of images each year. And to really make something scalable is really challenging. It's one thing to be able to develop an algorithm, but most places don't have the IT horsepower to actually adapt those algorithms into our clinical workflow. And I think that's one of the biggest barriers to actually getting from the algorithm development into a routine clinical practice, is just having the resources to be able to make it fit into what is a robust production environment within a radiology department.
Smashing talks. I'm a student from Harvard Medical School, and now I'm a graduate researcher in MGH Cancer Center. I have a little question for both GB and Alex. I think from my understanding, pardon my innocence, I think both of you are doing great things, cutting short the trial and error process by interpreting the relationships, associations, and the connections between existing information about drugs and targets and everything from patients. And by doing this, I think eventually it will replace the existing info by your AI produced info. And this will give you a huge power. If I compare you with Google, your company is such a great engine that people can search the relationship from your database. And I think, but eventually you guys are companies, so it's not an AI-based decision, it's a human decision. So I just want to know, how would you make sure that your decision will ensure this is a sure thing to make the best use of all the information that you create and you have right now?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Personally, I'm very happy to be in the great company of Alex and in your pantheon here. And I think one of the things, so I'm not seeing a near future in which would replace anything, frankly, at least in our company. I think though that we augment and enhance experts, definitely. Biology is so, why don't we have more cures around? Why don't we have more therapies? Why don't we have more molecules? Why are we still getting sick? It's just biology is really, really, really complicated, as it turns out. It's harder than driving a car. So that gives a sense of, I think it's going to be a long time before we can have an impact across the board, and AI can truly be a companion to everybody doing life sciences and particular drug discovery. That said, in terms of how we can ensure that we're making the best decisions, first of all, the best is not a thing. We can make better decisions, and at least in how I see it. And the way we proceed is that we try to take a wide spectrum of evidence. So we don't have one algorithm where if you give it a disease, it tells you, hey, this is the gene. We have a diversity of approaches, some drawing from omics, some drawing from knowledge graphs, some drawing from experts' insight directly into our knowledge base that contribute to a wider understanding of what does it look like, what is it looking like it's happening. And I think that kind of approach is, which is true in drug identification, also in molecular design, definitely patient stratification. It's a journey with the machine, but experts are leading the way. So I think the human judgment is going to keep being a very, very large part of that equation for a while, time to come. I don't know if I understand.
Alex, you want to take
Just
this
to add to this, again, I agree with JB that biology is very complex. And very often there is just nothing to train on. So you need to find ways to discover new things through AI and then to trust the output. And the only way you can do this is through multiple repetitions and validation and experimental models in disease-relevant models. So I think it's going to take a lot of time for us to be able to automate drug discovery completely. And by that time, probably new technologies like PROTACs, like CRISPR, like gene therapy, cell therapy, are going to become more abundant. So we're going to have more tools, but at the same time, it's going to be a shift in our focus and in everybody else's focus on those technologies as well. Personally, I think that ideally we should have personalized drug discovery. So if we are 100% certain that at some point in time we can create really great molecules for individual targets, because I think that individual target importance also changes not only from person to person, but also in time. So you really need to time the application of a specific small molecule within kind of the progression of the disease and look at not only one target, but multiple targets. And maybe at some point of time go away from the target hypothesis, like individual target hypothesis entirely, and target the process. And I don't think this procedure, this approach will become fully automated anytime soon. Not only from the technical perspective, but also from the just industry structure perspective. It's very difficult to partner with big pharma, extremely difficult. So sometimes, again, it takes much more time to sign an agreement than it is to do the work. And it's very difficult to even convince people, despite the publications, to work with you. And when you delivered something, it's very difficult to convince people to proceed with the finding, because it's a big bet for everybody. So human intelligence is not going to go away anytime soon. Maybe some Asian tigers, not necessarily China, that are a little bit more experimental right now, are going to go into that direction a little bit faster. So for example, there are lots of really cool projects in Korea right now. Some of our competitors are there right now, in Singapore as well, where people are trying to do kind of end-to-end quickly. But full automation, I don't think is going to be achieved anytime in the foreseeable future.
So we are at the end of our time for today. Wanted to thank all the panel members. I think there may have been one other question, but if we can keep it extremely brief, we can do it. But it would have to be very quick conversation.
Okay, so last question. Thanks, Alex. I have been following Insilico medicine for a long time. So in your side, you mentioned that you want to do some aging drugs and also some mortality. So in the future, what do you plan for the Insilico platform to be a general platform or some specialized department platform? Like the data for you to training the neural network, the receptor and the enzyme are quite different. And we can work hardly to generate a general platform. And in the future, how do you accumulate more data to make it more precise prediction? Thank you.
So there was 2 questions. Of course, I'm very focused on aging, and that's what drives the company very much, because pediatrics is a great place to kind of test some of the approaches, but the end goal is to make people live longer and more productively. To kind of keep as many people alive for as long as possible and more productive. I think that's the most altruistic goal anybody can set for themselves. And that's also one of the very good goals to set as a political campaign to kind of reduce the differences between nations nowadays. But you have to make money, so you have to specialize. And in our case, we decided to use generative chemistry as one of our major business drivers. So we do very well on kinases already, so almost perfect on many kinases. We do reasonably well on some receptors where crystal structure is known, and sometimes without the crystal structure and without any training sets, orphan targets. And we're going after transcription factors and PPIs. So generative chemistry, that's our core. We prefer to work with companies focusing on age-related diseases where there is a really clear pathway implicated in aging, so we can understand the biology around that pathway, learn the targets, help the company, get some data back, learn from that. And that's also one of the ways to acquire data. So very often, one of our investors called Juvenescence, they start new companies, and we sign contracts with those companies where we help them identify novel molecules, novel inhibitors or activators of their disease-relevant targets. And we get the early preclinical data back. So enzymatic assays, biological assays, disease-relevant assays to also help them optimize the molecule, but we get non-exclusive access to the data. So it's not patient-specific data, so we don't know the patient at all. So I try to stay away from patient data as much as possible, especially with our geographic distribution. But we get a lot of data from those smaller companies that are willing to push through very, very quickly and share the data. So individually, they're not losing data, and this data is not worthless, but it's not as valuable. But when you combine this from many, many sources, it's very valuable.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Please join us in thanking our panelists. Really a terrific job.